Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis, of the Present Folly Podcast. I'm joined again by Swithun, gone for like about a month, I think. Hello, Swithun. Keith Preston and Terminal Philosophy. Today's discussion will be how libertarians and anarchists have a love-hate relationship with history. So on the one hand, the more ideological, classically minded anarchists, much like libertarians, have a very future-oriented view of the world. The past is either fascist and reactionary, or it's nothing to learn from it. But there's two anarchists who are very well known for their historical work. One is Murray Bookchin, and the other is Peter Marshall. Peter Marshall wrote Demanding the Impossible. I mean, I know you've come across these types too, Keith. People have literally said, "Oh, well, Peter Marshall's book isn't real anarchism because the Taoists and the Christians couldn't have been anarchists because they don't believe in all of this stuff." And it's like, well, he's giving you an ideological history of how we got to anarchism, and these are properly understood as proto-anarchist predecessors. I mean, that there's no the Marxists can do this. I don't know why. Kautsky, for example, has his way of interpreting Christianity in these earlier movements. Whether I agree with that or not is another question. But they can at least do it. The anarchists, they can do it too, but if they do, they get cast out as heretics. The Anarchist Library says this about Murray Bookchin. They say he walked away. Murray Bookchin breaks with anarchism. Janet Beale. So it's like, you can't use Athens. You can't use New England. Actual examples of direct democracy, but, can't do that. Now, the Libertarians, their view is rooted in the work of Mises and human action based on praxeology. So if we look at a page, it looks like it's page 32 of Human Action, we read about history. The subject matter of all historical science is the past. They cannot teach us anything which is valid for human actions, that is, for the future too. The study of history makes a man wise and judicious, but it does not by itself provide any knowledge and skill which could be utilized for handling concrete tasks. And when I started reading Human Action when I was still a fusionist, that's when I threw it away. I'm like, that's ridiculous. I mean, a case in point would be the founding of the United States. If you read the Federalist Papers, they are looking at ancient classical civilization as an example on how to live in the 18th century and chart a course into the future. Now, the big difference here is, how do you assume? Do you assume, like Solomon, everything is vanity, everything's been tried before, in which case history can provide a guide for the future? Or do you believe in a kind of progressivist development where the future is nothing like the past? And that's the sort of implicit assumption that both libertarians and anarchists have. Otherwise, why would they have an hostility to studying it? It's fundamentally dissimilar from the past. But then the question is it? And then furthermore, with the libertarians, you have Rothbard, who writes his 3-volume history of economics. You've got revisionist historians like Ralph Raico, Tom Woods, and Jeff Regenbach. I mean, I would argue, which is it? Do we use history, or do we just have a pure praxeological approach? Again, there hasn't been a consistent working out of this. Now, that's not to say libertarians and anarchists can't be good historians. There are good historians in their ranks. It's just that the broader movement as a whole has difficulty dealing with them and incorporating them. So you take a more of a historical approach to anarchism, Keith. So why don't we start with you?
Yeah, well, I think we have to separate different phases in anarchist history if we're looking at the relationship between anarchist thought and historians. Classical anarchists from, say, the 19th century and early 20th century were not generally as hostile to the past as which you might find in modern anarchism. For instance, if you go back and read the works of Kropotkin, like The State, Its Historic Role, he actually goes back and talks about different forms of statecraft or societies that had existed historically, and he talked about how the medieval communes and things like that were prototypes for anarchist thinking. So he saw himself and his own ideas as being rooted in historical traditions of which he saw as evolving and which he saw himself as building on. And it wasn't just Kropotkin. If you look at one of the earliest histories of anarchist thought, modern anarchist thought, it was written by Max Natlau, a German anarchist, and he had a similar view. He traced the beginnings of anarchism back to the Stoics and Cynics and some ancient Greek thinkers. And you mentioned Peter Marshall. Peter Marshall is a British historian who has written about this more recently, much more recently, where he takes a similar method as Max Natlow. He starts with ancient Chinese philosophy and Greece and some of the ideas that came out of the Axial Age, and traces the development of what he considers to be proto-anarchist thought all throughout these different historical epochs. He even talks about thinkers like, he talks about the medieval Christian thinkers. He talks about traditional societies. He talks about medieval Islam. And he talks about early modern thinkers that he sees as building blocks in anarchist history, everyone from Jean-Jacques Rousseau to John Locke to Thomas Paine and Edmund Burke. He talks about Nietzsche. But you're correct, though, that some modern anarchists try to write all of this stuff out of anarchist history. I know when Peter Marshall's book came out, there's an anarchist journal called Anarcho-Syndicalist Review, which has long been known for being famously sectarian, or at least famously sectarian within anarchist circles. And of course, they came out with a denunciation of Marshall's book, saying, well, he's not really talking about anarchism. He's just talking about anybody who ever had ideas that we might kind of sort of agree with. And then there's on the libcom.org website, there's a discussion of Marshall, or there used to be, I don't know if it's still up, but where they talk about, well, what's he doing, including Nietzsche in a work on anarchism? Doesn't he know Nietzsche was a proto-fascist or something like that? So I've even seen some anarchists, like there's this one book that was written by a couple of South African anarchists some years ago, Michael Schmidt and Lucian van den Walt, and they were basically trying to write Proudhon and William Godwin and Benjamin Tucker and Tolstoy out of the history of anarchism, saying, well, no, actually real anarchism is nothing but anarcho-communism or anarcho-syndicalism. Of course, one of these guys eventually got written out of anarchism himself, one of the authors of this book, because supposedly he was a white nationalist or a racist or something like that. I don't know what the whole story was behind that. And I know there's a guy who has criticized some of my work, an Irish anarchist named Ian O'Connor, and he says that the problem with my outlook, I'm paraphrasing, but his words were that my point of view wants to include everybody in history who ever resembled an anarchist or something like that, and he insists that real anarchism begins with Kropotkin. He even wants to write Bakunin out of anarchism along with Proudhon. I think there may be other reasons for that, yeah. So you do have this kind of thing where you have a sort of an ahistorical approach to theory and philosophy. I won't talk as much about the libertarians. I think probably Swithun is the best guy to get into that a bit. But yeah, that's the issues you have with the anarchist in history.
All right, Swithun, the libertarians in history.
Okay, first, the point I was going to make is liberty et le Sueur mentioned. When Mises is discussing history in human action, I don't remember the precise context, but he's primarily referring to economics more than anything else. I suspect that's from the early, more philosophical chapters. And his major point is not that you can't learn anything from history, because he mentions that in the quote. The main point was rather that you could not derive universal laws regarding human action, which required a purely a prioristic approach. Not that there was nothing you could learn from history, because he obviously does think there's something you can learn from history, because then he discusses, which he develops in Theory and History, timology or thymology, which was sort of a hybrid sort of psychology, which gave you insight into behavior. So it wasn't sort of strict history as such, but it required some sort of historical basis. And you fuse that with purely economic ideas based in some scarcity, time preference, the classic sort of Misesian categories. So I don't think that Mises per se is anti-history. Now, there could well be some of the libertarian movements that are. I mean, there's definitely very much sort of like a futurist strand in libertarianism. There was an author, was it something Neil, who died recently, who's a science fiction author. I think he attended Smith, I can't remember his name, who tended in that direction. But that said, I would say that under sort of like internet libertarians as such, they do tend to sort of take a purely sort of economic view of things and ignore and sort of take that as the sole basis of any form of political philosophy, without any reference to any sort of historical events or how things may work out. I mean, so for instance, you could argue to some extent Bob Murphy does this with his expectation of how private defense would be organized. It would be organized on this as yet there may be historical precedent to some extent, but his sort of idea of basically private standing armies being funded by insurance companies, which are sort of voluntarily paid for. I mean, that, to my knowledge, has never been approached historically. Now, it's not to say it couldn't work in principle, but he certainly doesn't necessarily make reference to various historical events. As you pointed out, Rothbard attempts to, although I think most of Rothbard's arguments are essentially a way of propagandizing the average American to go, look, all the original Americans were basically libertarian anarchists. You should be too. I think that was Rothbard's primary goal in his sort of history of the United States. That's not to say that he wasn't interested in history. He does attempt to make historical references and does engage it to some extent, although his major involvement is in the history of ideas more than anything else. So I do, as that said, I do think that there is, I think the problem with the libertarians, and I think this goes, well, this, you could see where my prejudices go here. It's, I think the ahistoricism to some extent, I think, is probably more pronounced in the left libertarians to a large extent, primarily because they tend more into sort of environmental determinism. That is, well, we can remold man and we can create a new man to live in the libertarian sort of paradise. Whereas the right libertarians would take a generally more pessimistic view and a more innate, and in some cases, biological determinist position, which then tends more towards, well, we're just going to make the best of a bad job primarily. Now, the best of a bad job, and no, what has happened in the past can happen in the future. Well, why? Well, because biologically speaking, humans are largely the same over various periods of time, and so there are things you can learn. So I think it does depend on the libertarian you're talking about. Although I do think I think the split is probably mostly going to be on the progressive and the non-progressive wing more than anything else, because the progressive wing can just go, oh yeah, well, that happened in the past, but like, when we get true libertarianism, we'll live forever, like some of the earlier utopian communists said. Except they kind of will, because they'll probably go to some sort of like techno-futurist position where we can sort of upload our consciousness to the cloud, etc., in some of the more fanciful writing. So to conclude my opening remarks, yes, there is a general lack of historical understanding in internet libertarian types, although there is a large amount of libertarian work done on sort of historical episodes. I mean, Ed Stringham, for example, in Anarchy of the Law, has a compendium of various essays on historical events which could be considered anarchistic in the legal world. Bruce Benson, whilst not necessarily a sort of pure libertarian as such, focus on the history of sort of like policing in England. So there certainly are people who take it seriously. But I would say that most of sort of like the anarcho-capitalists don't typically reference history that much when they're sort of predicting what a future anarcho-capitalist society would look like.
All right, terminal philosophy.
Right. Well, first I will say that my strengths here tend to lean towards the libertarian side of the issue. With regards to the issues at libertarianism, and by which I mean more present day or more left-leaning libertarians, is that there is this this heavy reliance on ahistorical claims. Now that can mean a whole host of issues. Probably some of the more red meat, juicy ones might be something like transgenderism or abortion, as if these are somewhat, historical legacies or traditions that are popular, or that they form some sort of solid basis for justifying, limited state intervention or something like that. So that is, I think, what maybe you could call a cultural problem with left-leaning libertarianism, because these are issues divided along cultural lines. And another way of getting at this is that many left libertarians and anarchists have this problem of praxis versus theory. Now, of course, in almost any conversation with politics, one can basically trace the roots of various ideas and ideologies all the way back to something like the Greek city-states, which is often popular. But with regards to this problem of praxis versus theory, left libertarians oftentimes have given themselves the advantage of never having had a concrete historical example of their ideal society having been created. This is something similar to, a left-leaning socialist saying, oh, that's not real socialism and so forth. So there's a lot of left libertarianism that kind of lives and sort of seems to die in this theoretical realm, which again, you can say that for many different ideologies, by the way, too, not just anarchism or various forms of libertarianism. In regards to Swithun's comments on Human Action by Ludwig von Mises, I did read Human Action years ago, and from what I remember from it, I do remember the majority of the work being mostly economic in its claims, and that there is this heavy reliance on markets, because markets are what provide the basis for economic calculation. And he was all about maximizing human pleasures and something like that. But I do remember the majority of that work being more economic than philosophical. Now, I'm not the Mises expert here for sure, but that's certainly what I remember. And I think one other thing I'll say that might be something a bit more of a philosophical problem with perhaps libertarian interpretations of history is that I often sometimes don't understand by what many libertarians mean. And this could be, right-leaning or left-leaning libertarians, is I really don't mean what a lot of these people mean by coercion or state coercion. Now, for many libertarians, a lot of their outlook is very materialistic and deterministic. So, so if that's the case, now, of course, that's not the case for every libertarian, but if things are certainly deterministic, if it's a deterministic universe, well, then, I don't know, we've got some sort of problem here. Like, then where is the coercion? Where does the coercion come into play? So I guess I'll just leave my initial comments at that.
Yeah. One point, and again, I think this is a bit of overlap with both libertarians and anarchists, is, Mises' claim that you cannot derive general rules for human action from history. Now, this is not of economics, and maybe what Mises is saying about economics applies only in that sphere. Because if we look at military theory, and we look at people who either view military theory as purely theoretical and abstract, like, say, a Jomini, or something that is derived from historical precedent, like Clausewitz, it's fairly clear on the battlefield where, we determine winning by who's, still possessing the battlefield, that a purely theoretical account of war doesn't work. And it never has worked. And we saw the failure with that on the War on Terror recently. You have to derive axioms for war from previous experiences. So, for example, at the beginning of the 16th century, with the age of pike and shot, they dug up the Dutch and other Protestants dug up the old Roman military manual by Vigilius from the 4th century AD. And even though it was totally different in the realm of technology, they applied it in the 16th century to defeat the Spanish and the Holy Roman Empire. And so there is an applicability of axioms of war independent of the age they come in. We also saw in the interwar period of World War II the rise of utopian futurism, with how a bomber would always get through. You could just bomb the enemy into submission. Tanks could operate independently without combined arms support. And then there was a more down-to-earth, development, which we saw in Germany and the Soviet Union, which saw the need for combined mechanized forces and had a lower reliance on bombers and utopianism in that regard. And again, it was the German blitzkrieg that crushed the Western allies, who are using this more abstract, theoretical, utopian war, with people like J.S.C. Fuller and H.B. Liddell Hart pushing the envelope there. And so what we see is when it really comes to human action and the price of failure is death, the people who come in with purely theoretical assumptions usually lose. And people who come into this engagement using what they've learned from previous historical experience usually win. So, how precise are these axioms? How many axioms can you fit in that box? How universal are they? Those are all, I think, open questions. But what I will say, in this area, we do have this example where if you use purely theoretical axioms, you're usually going to lose. And if you develop axioms accumulated over centuries of history, you're usually going to win. And I think that's where me and Mises part ways. And I also think that this also gets into the question of, is the past fundamentally like the future and vice versa? So, do you agree with Solomon? Everything's been tried before at some point. Or do you agree with the utopians of the, Enlightenment and human rationalism, that we can have a blank slate and start all over again? Because I think there are elements of both of those people in anarchist and libertarian circles. I'll first of all throw the question to you, Swithun.
So when it comes to history, Mises would say, even with the warfare example, the question is, well, okay, yes, B followed A, following a particular strategy. The question is why, and how do we know why that took place? And at least for Mises's sort of economic outlook, in the economic realm, the very fact that, for instance, let's suppose everybody for the last 100 years was always paid, like 95% of the population were paid every month rather than being paid weekly. He would say, well, it doesn't follow from that that's going to happen into the future. So we can't really base any of our sort of most fundamental economic categories on that. So the question I think Mises might have is, when it comes to war, is, I suppose, on what level you are attempting to analyze it on. Now, that said, I think Mises and Rothbard are depart here, because Rothbard basically advocates more of an Aristotelian approach to economics rather than a more of a Kantian one. Now, I know there are people who claim that Mises isn't a Kantian, but he very much looks like he is. I suppose you could say he's not a pure Kantian potentially, but he definitely gives off that vibe. Rothbard, on the other hand, makes a claim that essentially that the basic ideas of economics, scarcity, for instance, is just an inductive statement, and it is true. We can't really deny it, and we're just going to take that as a given, which is more consistent with his more sort of Aristotelian framework. And interesting is, aside with that, Rothbard was very much a believer in free will, whereas Mises was a determinist. I can't remember how Mises squares that with choice in human action. I'm pretty does reference it, but I don't remember exactly what he said. But Rothbard very much was in favor of free will. He used the argument basically that, well, you wouldn't be able to know anything if everything was determined, because the only way to know that that something is true is because you believe it to be true based on reasons for doing so, and so you must believe it based on those reasons. And if it's purely deterministic, then you would not be basing it on that. Well, I think he's having here a form of a biological determinism more than anything else, and therefore you'd have no basis for believing anything that you do believe to be true. So Rothbard certainly would take history in that sense more seriously, because he takes more of a sort of an inductive approach to the foundations of things. So I think fundamentally here what we've got is a question of methodology, which is a very sort of autistic libertarian thing to talk about. The problem with people who, such as yourself, Todd, if you suggest, and we had an episode discussing this a while ago, is what can you actually draw from history? How do you infer from what happened in the past to that it will happen in the future? And on what basis do you do so without it being effectively ad hoc? Now, I'm not saying you can't do that, but rather I think it a lot more difficult to say that since this certain arrangement existed in the past, that this is likely to happen in similar circumstances in the future. To the point about utopianism and about whether something has been tried or not, I'm pretty sure that any political philosophy that people espouse is going to be marginally different for something that existed before, and so in that sense hasn't been tried. Now there may be proto examples of it, which is maybe more what you're getting at, but I think pretty much everybody, well, maybe not everybody, but a lot of people will go, well, no, this isn't the exact thing that I actually advocate. So we've got a question of degree as to I suppose you could say, whether there's continuity of experiments of the past or whether it's a radical break. I think that is probably a better way of describing it than to say that there are either people who are based in history and those who are just utopian, because everybody, even if they claim they're based in history, won't be exactly the same. So I'm pretty sure, Todd, that your New Zion idea has never in its precise elements been tried before, which doesn't mean that it isn't historically based in certain respects and couldn't in theory work. Or even
let me just quickly interject here. The methodology that I'm advocating is what we saw in the Constitutional Convention of 1787. Had anything like the U.S. Republic been tried before? Not in the exact contours. But if you read the Federalist Papers, they're replete with study of classical and medieval elements to then derive a plausible model for 18th century North America. That's the methodology I'm advocating.
Oh, no, I know that's the methodology, but I said he's still got the problem of going from historical things that have worked in the past and then going to the future. I mean, so for instance, with the development of Austrian economics, you have a big debate basically between the historicists and the Austrian school. And the historicists are just like, yeah, well, it's happened in the past. It just works for this time period, but, it might not work for the future, and you can't really sort of generalize in that sense. So Austrians are like, no. There is this base fundamental way of looking at things, which is the same throughout time. So, yeah, that is I know that's the position you hold. It's just not necessarily straightforward to distinguish that methodology to argue from certain forms of libertarian thought. And to say, I think it's a question of continuity and radical break, I think, is the main. I mean, also, even if you have a radical break, you could even say it still has elements of the past. So, I mean, for instance, Keith's pan-anarchist position, I mean, that hasn't happened, well, at least not since, I don't know, let's take the 17th century or earlier, anything approaching it, which doesn't mean that it couldn't happen. And whether it's exactly in the same form as happened historically, probably not. Doesn't mean it couldn't work. Well, not necessarily. I think it's a question of what things will necessarily continue and which you kind of have to take account of, and those things which could in principle change. Which really, I think, to a large degree is a question of to what extent do you think human nature is sort of innate, and to what extent is it environmentally determined. That would be my general view on the
matter. All right. Determinal philosophy, what are your thoughts on this?
All right. Well, in regards to what you said earlier, Todd, which was, which is this dichotomy of highly theoretical ideas versus more practical, down to earth methodologies. That I will say that there was an anarchist, a lesser known anarchist whose name I can't remember, that based their methodology and praxis off of the Max Weber definition of the state. And Weber's definition of the state came from this a lecture that he had called Politics as a Vocation. It was around the end of World War I. And it's basically defined as a human community that claims the monopoly of the legitimate use of force within a given territory. Now, I did try and Google his name, but I will just say that Max Weber, in terms of sociology, I know he's not a libertarian, or, well, at least to my knowledge, I don't know that he's a libertarian or not, but I know that he is certainly more pragmatic in his sort of his sociology and his history and his ethnography, whereas I think a lot of determinists and materialists, again, they sort of have this, they tend to lean heavily on this, well, I would say, first of all, historical revisionism, but then second, what I had mentioned earlier, which is this, they can sort of work with this advantage that they have in the sense that their ideal state has yet to come about. And so they kind of have this, this sort of argumentative advantage of never having to, put their ideas to test and, to the test in the concrete world. So, yeah, but I think I'll leave my comments at that. One thing I'll say too is that was it Bakunin who had the definition of a, never mind. I think I'll leave my comments at that. Thank you.
All right, Keith.
Well, I think the issue of do humans have a fixed nature, and can we judge the future based on what we experience in the past and things like that? I think that really is a significant dividing line between some of the political tendencies we're talking about now, anarchists and libertarians and others. For instance, in my approach, as a lot of viewers probably know, is I tend to base a lot of what I do on historical precedent. I have this concept called pan-anarchism or anarcho-pluralism or whatever, and I base it on, what have past societies actually experienced? To what degree were past societies effective at controlling power? Have there ever actually been functional anarchist communities? If so, when, where, and how, and under what conditions, and how long did they last, and things like that. Those are my areas of interest. There's a guy in anarchist circles who's a strong critic of mine, who also identifies as a transhumanist. And I saw something that he tweeted recently where he was talking about, he said he'll be the first to admit his ideas go against human nature or something like that. And this guy has this, from my reading of him at least, is that he has this idea where he kinds of envisions this utopian world where everybody can pretty much do anything they want, whenever they want, for whatever reason they want, except be reactionary, whatever that means at a particular time. But this guy, like I said, he's very into this idea of markets as a force. He identifies as a leftist and as an Antifa, but he also favors markets because he thinks markets have innovative power and things like that, and that fits with his transhumanist outlook, where it's all about he talks about things like life extension, extending the average life expectancy, where people become immortal and stuff like that. And I've come across ideas like that among certain types of anarchists and libertarians. There's this one libertarian I know of who once said, well, in the future we will be able to change our genders and skin colors, the same way we change clothes now, and this person wasn't just talking about transgender people and stuff like that. And he was saying, well, just as if you want to, you can just become another race. And he meant literally like through technology, you could, I guess, have transracial surgery or, genetics self-alteration or something like that. I come across that kind of stuff among certain types of libertarians and anarchists. I mean, stuff that's really more like science fiction than philosophy or history. And you've always seen this kind of thing among anarchists, I know, and certainly, and also socialists, or certainly early socialists, and some libertarians as well. Some of the 19th century utopians had some really wild ideas. Like one of my favorites was Charles Fourier. He envisioned these utopian communes where you had rivers of lemonade. That was one of the things that he envisioned. Although with modern technology, maybe you could have that. If you would have to have somebody to make the lemonade in substantial enough quantity, and then you'd have to have some kind of I guess you'd have to have an indoor, domed community or something where the rain never gets in your river or whatever. You could have an artificial river that's made of lemonade. So maybe the transhumanists or futurists have a point with that. But I have come across that quite a bit. For example, you see this argument being extended to all kinds of areas of life. One thing we're seeing now in the United States is demographic change, where the Western European descended traditional ethnic majority is going to be a minority, within a couple of decades or so. And of course, people on the left who tend to be more futuristic, they're saying, well, that's wonderful. We're going to have this kind of rainbow multicultural utopia. And people on the right tend to be more like, well, wait a minute, historically multi-ethnic societies where there's no, ethnic core, those kinds of societies tend to be unstable, and they tend to experience civil war more frequently and things like that. And I think this basic argument it creeps into libertarianism and anarchism and the philosophies we're talking about now, in the sense that that there's this idea of how much is the past the guide to the future. Like some people will say, well, look, they used to say that you couldn't have society without slavery. So okay, we figured out, well, we don't really need to have chattel slavery. We can still have society, or you can't have society without an absolute monarchy. That those kinds of ideas were once common, but then there's also this idea of, well, there are social changes that don't require an alteration in human nature, and there are those that do. For instance, whether you're going to have capital punishment or not is simply a matter of changing the law. Okay, well, the law is you have capital punishment, or the law is you don't have capital punishment. But when it comes to the idea of, well, we're not going to need capital punishment because nobody's ever going to do anything violent and murder somebody, well, that's an entirely different proposition, all right? Because we don't really have any precedent for a society where human nature is basically changed to where nobody is violent. We know that most all societies historically had some degree of violence, and the ones that didn't tended to be small and very homogenous and things like that. So most societies, there have been violence, there have been murders and things like that. There have been punishments for crime. You can debate on what the punishment ought to be or how to go about preventing crime. But then when you get to things like, we're just not going to have, we're not going to need laws because nobody's going to want to do anything to hurt anybody. That's an entirely different kind of futuristic, otherworldly idea. Interestingly, William Godwin, an early anarchist, sort of a prototype for classical anarchism, he had ideas kind of along those lines. He had this idea that over time, through education and enlightenment and moral evolution, human beings would learn to be more, say, altruistic or less greedy or less aggressive or less selfish, and you could have anarchism in that way. That was kind of how he envisioned anarchism coming about, with people would just become so enlightened and so educated and refined and genteel that they would be, everybody would be like a late 18th century middle-class English person, pretty much.
Yeah, well, I'll start with sort of my final thoughts as we go around. I think what I would say with history and how we can use it, there's an idea of like going against the grain of human nature, against the grain of existing physical realities. And I don't just mean technical realities, but like the laws of nature themselves. You're not going to have an anti-gravity machine for something like that. And so the question is, are you going to improve the wheel or reinvent the wheel? So the difference, whether it's economics, politics, warfare, whatever, there seems to be these two positions. One is improving the wheel. So we have a wheel. It's not perfect. We get it. We make it better over time. Or we just reinvent the wheel. And if we look at examples, I would argue throughout history that those who have a more conservative approach and improve rather than reinvent the wheel are generally more successful, both in terms of longevity and having a stable political reality to live in rather than a flash in the pan that just disappears. Ancient Rome as a republic was more long-lasting than the Greek city-states, in large part because unlike the Greek city-states, they had more practical philosophy to work with. We see this with the American versus the French Republic. We see this with the Clausewitz versus Germany. And the idea is, rather than reinventing the wheel, we improve it. So I would argue that the historicist approach that says people are fundamentally the same now as they were 4,000 years ago, or however far back you want to go, and past behavior is in general a pretty good guide as to how far you can push the limits. Obviously, within the limits, there is complexity, there is difference. But as I mentioned in another podcast with Derek Jensen, even if we look at, say, the ancient societies of Greece and Rome, the Islamic Near East, medieval Christendom, and the early European colonies, they're all quote-unquote patriarchal, but they're all very different from each other in other ways. So I'm not saying that they're all homogenous and the same. And to the extent that libertarians and anarchists take this approach, and there are some in both camps that do, like I said, Murray Bookchin and Peter Marshall for the anarchist, and more right libertarians on the libertarian side take that trend towards that approach. And I think that because of that, they can give better accounts for what they want. Swithun.
I think a lot of people would agree that you should improve the wheel rather than reinvent it in libertarian camps. The question arises, though, in which areas is there a wheel everywhere in all possible domains that already exists which needs to be improved? Or are there things where the wheel, as it were, doesn't exist? Or there's something, I don't know, something much inferior to, I don't know, like a triangle. And therefore we need to change that and radically alter it. So whilst in general, I think you could get a lot of agreement over your sort of distinction between reinventing and improving the wheel. The question arises, which areas do we have a wheel that we can improve? And that would then generate significantly greater levels of disagreement. So, because I would say, I think that I would tend to agree with your characterization, although we might disagree on which areas we have something we can work with to improve, and other areas where we need a radical break. I mean, this is hard to say. I mean, so for it's like an economics example. I mean, I don't think anybody in here would want to defend the current banking system. Now, has it been the case that there's ever been a widespread used 100% reserve banking system? Probably not since the 16th century. Although you could argue there are times where it was closer, or it was further away. Now, would this be a superior system? Would this be a radical break? Yes, it would be a radical break. Would it be a superior system? I think so. Now, you could though say, well, you know, that's not really the kind of thing I'm talking about. But as I say, this is where we're going to get an issue. So firstly is, do we consider ourselves of a radical break, or do we want to have continuation? And then the question is, well, is that a principle we use everywhere, or are there areas in which we do need radical breaks? I mean, are there areas, for instance, in which we need to move from the horse or the carriage to the motor car, in sort of Henry Ford sort of statement? So I think going forward, this would be interesting to sort of try to divide various sort of social phenomena up into particular categories, and then sort of try to come up with arguments as to which ones can you basically not change, and which ones can you? And as Keith made an interesting point, with slavery is a good example. That, well, yeah, we could get rid of slavery. So I think going forward, that would be an interesting exercise, and that would, I think, more clearly delineate the positions.
All right, terminal philosophy.
Right. Well, I tend to agree with the notion that humans have been more or less very similar since the days of antiquity, and it's probably easier to improve a state than it is to create something like a theoretical stateless society with that's heavily dependent on a lot of abstract philosophy. That's not to say it can't be done, but we have the advantage of looking at past history to base states off of. I think the history of libertarianism and anarchism is really interesting, and I'll just say, just kind of as an anecdote, that I've always been fairly anti-neoconservative, and one of the more interesting developments of libertarianism in the 20th century was the phenomenon of people like Barry Goldwater, where by the time Reagan came around, it became clear at that point that there was this, maybe perhaps a bit before Reagan in the 70s, there was this option that the Republican Party had between sort of this Reagan neoconservative option, or more of a, I guess you could say, perhaps like a quasi-nationalistic libertarianism that Barry Goldwater was trying to get at, even if he wasn't doing it perfectly well throughout portions of his career. But I will say that that's something that I've been a bit more interested in terms of the development of libertarianism in the 20th century. But yes, I mean, in regards to political philosophy and things like that, I think at this moment I'd consider myself, probably a statist compared to most anarchists out there. But yeah, this is an interesting subject because oftentimes you see, the use of historical revisionism, or just blatant disregard, a disregard of certain well-established histories by certain libertarians. Again, this isn't across the board, but yeah, it can be difficult. And I think I'll just repeat one more time too, that the issue of what is coercion, or how can we, in a sort of a concrete way, define coercion in terms of libertarian politics or anarchist politics, that seems to determine a lot of the ideas from that point on, depending on how you define that. So anyways, thanks for having me. It's a good conversation.
Yeah. Keith, final words. You're still muted, Keith, there.
Yeah, well, it's interesting that terminal philosophy brings up the neocons, because there's actually a way in which anarchist thought and the neocons overlap, as much as I hate to have to say that, and that is this idea of creative destruction. Bakunin actually coined the phrase creative destruction, and meaning that, well, we can make a new world by destroying the old one, pretty much. Or it's kind of like this the idea that Bakunin was heavily influenced by the Russian nihilists, and their idea was, well, basically we build a new world by blowing things up. Let's just blow up the old world, and we'll get whatever comes after that will be utopia. Ironically, during the George W. Bush era, when the neocons were at their zenith of power, the phrase creative destruction made a comeback, and it was coming from people like Dick Cheney. And I remember when they started using that phrase, I remember thinking, oh, this is bad. It was because I was like, first of all, it makes anarchists look bad. I'm like, I hope they never trace that phrase back to Bakunin. Also, the sentiment behind it is a bit problematic as well. I mean, it's one thing if you're a fugitive Russian radical, hiding out in Panama from the Tsar's secret police, to talk, to write books fantasizing about creative destruction. But when you've got the American military under your disposal, and then you're thinking about that, then it's a whole different problem. But yeah, the historical framework in which some types of radicalism works, I think, or the ahistorical framework, I think, is one of the worst weaknesses in a lot of different radical theories. One of the criticisms that Russell Kirk, the conservative philosopher, had libertarians, he said, well, they just postulate this idea of this abstract liberty. He says no society's ever worked like that. There's never been a society ordered on the non-aggression principle or something like that. And I think that's certainly a valid criticism of any philosophy. I mean, not just libertarianism, but I do tend to think that if somebody is proposing something radically different than most or all of whatever came before, the burden of proof is on them and to explain why this is going to be better. Like if I say, for example, that, we're going to get a better society if everybody drinks a gallon of carrot juice a day or something. Well, the burden of proof is on me to prove why that's the case. So I do think that that this is a very valid criticism of anarchist and libertarian and a lot of other radical thought, in the sense that you do find a lot of ahistorical thinking. And I've actually tried to correct for that in some of the work that I've done. I've pointed to a lot of weaknesses that I see in some of these philosophies and tried to say, well, no, it would be better if you approach it from this angle. And of course, that ruffles a lot of people's feathers in the process. And we see this kind of argument going on with issues generally. Like one has to do with changing family structures. In the last 50 years or so, we've seen the family structures in the Western world change a lot. We're moving away from the bourgeois nuclear family model, more towards, polygamy and gay marriage, or polyamory and gay marriage, and, single parenting and all that kind of stuff. And that obviously has a lot of critics, but it has people who praise it as well. And it's rooted, I think, in the same debate we're having now. Well, okay, people on the more conservative side will say, look, it was the bourgeois nuclear family that coincides with the rise of modern society and unprecedented levels of prosperity and technology and economic growth and things like that, as opposed to ancient barbarian societies where they had polygamy and all that kind of stuff. And then there's, of course, the other side of it is, oh, well, that's just a transitional phase. Now we're moving towards whatever, where the family is just whatever you want it to be, basically. And so I think I think that argument's always going to be there, and it seems to apply to just about every issue.
All right. Thanks again, Keith. Swithun, Terminal Philosophy. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. This is Todd Lewis, the President Podcast, signing off.